Coming up, the Dog and Fox. Nice turret outside, horrible modern decor inside, unappealing beer, but an opportunity to tell a fun anecdote about Oliver Reed's horse. The Rose and Crown, another horrible paint job, but at least some nice older features, and although the ales were again disagreeable, it was a one-time haunt of a controversial Victorian poet who covered subject matter which will probably prevent this video from earning any advertising revenue. The Fox and Grapes, a pub I feel bad for saying mean things about because the staff were very friendly, but some interior designer a decade ago, in their infinite wisdom, decided to remove all the original pub fittings and leave behind a space that has all the charm of a dentist's waiting room. The Hand in Hand, at last somewhere which actually felt like a pub, with great beer, although nowhere in Wimbledon is entirely safe from the Farrow and Wrecking Ball. And finally, the Crooked Billet, a pub named after a bent stick. Or is it a pub named after a street? Was the street named after a bent stick? Does it matter? Yet more regrettable interior design and underwhelming beer, but at least it has deck chairs. I'm here in Wimbledon today. It is the eve of the Wimbledon Tennis Championships. Thought this might be a good time to come down to this leafy corner of southwest London to see what it has to offer, if anything, on the historic pub front. Oliver Reed, a famous one-time resident of Wimbledon and no stranger to the pub, devised a pub crawl in Wimbledon that he called the Wimbledon Run, later came to be referred to as the Wimbledon 8. Only 6 of those 8 pubs still exist today. One of them has also been renamed. I'm going to go to the remaining 5 to see what they're like in 2024. Pub number 1, the Dog and Fox. Cheers from the Dog and Fox. Let's take a quick look at the exterior first. According to the What Pub website, it was rebuilt in 1869. There is a mention of that rebuild in the building news in 1868. It's likely a former coaching inn. Interestingly, there are some stables just behind the pub today. They're run as a separate business, and I think that may also be a hangover from that era of the coaching inn, and we'll come back to those stables later because they do tell us a little bit about Oliver Reed. It's almost 2 distinct buildings, really. There's a main sort of fairly boxy part that I'm sitting next to right now, which is somewhat stucco covered, and I think that is probably the part that was built or rebuilt in 1869. There is another wing in red brick with a rather fancy turret that I think would probably be octagonal if it had walls on all sides, and I assume a copper roof sort of finial to the top of it, also a bay window with some crenellations. All of that to me looks very sort of circa 1900, and I think that was likely a later addition to this largely 1869 pub. It's ran today also as a hotel, and I think that has been the case for quite a large part of its history. Let's take a quick look inside. As I said, on today's tour, I'm sorry, we're just not going to get a lot of delightful old pub interiors. This is the nature of Wimbledon in 2024. Everything has been very gastro-pubified, very liberal use of Farrow Ball paint pretty much everywhere. Let's just try and look to the positive though. There were 1 or 2 corners of this interior that I thought were slightly more pleasant than others. There is this corner here with a fireplace and some wood panelling around it. There's a little bit of nice mosaic work around the bar counter. I assume that is all more modern, but the name of the pub is spelled out there. The bar counter is at least a hefty piece of wood with fielded panelling. Being in Wimbledon, and I think this is going to be a running theme, there is of course a display of tennis rackets and other tennis memorabilia. Quick look at the history, starting with the name. I suspect Dog and Fox is essentially a variant of Fox and Hounds. That's a very common pub name and likely attests to, at some point in history, fox hunting in the area. Here's Wimbledon at the time of John Rock's map of 1746. The location of the Dog and Fox at that time corresponds to just beneath that E, where Wimbledon is spelled across the village. The earliest newspaper mention I could find of a dog and fox in Wimbledon is from 1778, not long after that map. It's then later mentioned in the Post Office Directory of 1851, and it seems at that time there were only 2 inns of any note in Wimbledon, here and the Rose and Crown. It's marked by name on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, and that again suggests to me that the red brick wing with the turret is a later addition, looking at the outline of the building at that time. If you compare that to the mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map, you can see quite clearly the outline of that turret at the corner and even the bay window, I think. Oliver Reed's horse Dougal was stabled practically next door. One day Oliver Reed was drinking here in the Dog and Fox, and he started to feel a bit sorry for his horse cooped up in the stables there. So he popped next door to the estate agent and asked if they had a field for sale that he could allow his horse to roam around in and graze freely. Apparently they didn't have just a field, but they did have a 56-bedroom mansion called Broom Hall near Coldharbour in Surrey. So Oliver Reed bought that for his horse, and that became his home for much of the 1970s. It's a Young's pub today, as most of them on today's tour are going to be, and this lineup began to look very familiar after a few pubs. They had Wimbledon SW19 as a guest beer, but that is unfortunately very grapefruity. It has some version of Cascade hops in it, so I just went for a half of Young's London Original. Pub number 2, the Rose and Crown. Cheers from the Rose and Crown. It's a Young's pub. Pretty much all of them are going to be today. I did take a quick look at the beer lineup here. Again, they had a couple from Young's plus Wimbledon Brewery's something or other that was very grapefruity, so I've just gone for Young's London Original. Let's take a look at the exterior of the Rose and Crown first. It's a fairly unfussy, in a way, brick building, and it's clearly had various alterations over the years, judging by the state of some of that brickwork. Curious mixture of bonds. The style of the brickwork in places seems to alternate between English and Flemish from here to there, and that may attest to some of the different alterations it's had. A mixture of stock and red brick as well, I think. The entrance on the right-hand side as you're facing it looks newer to me. There is a large lantern suspended over what is now a window, but I suspect that may have at one time been an entrance. The window underneath that has an oval pane in it, and that has been there since at least the 1970s, and I could show you a photo from the 1970s to attest to that. And in fact, most of the frontage looks pretty much unchanged since the 1970s. Of course, today I'm seeing it in the run-up to the Wimbledon Championships, so it's bedecked with giant tennis balls and some such. But looking beyond that, you can see that the majority of the frontage has more or less stayed the same for at least half a century. There are very few photos of this on, for example, Google Maps of the interior. It's one of those pubs where everyone just takes a picture of their food, which is usually not a good sign in terms of interesting interior features. I think it fared ever so slightly better than I was expecting. Certainly some shades of paint on the wall that I wouldn't have chosen myself, but there is a flagstone floor. The bar counter looks newer to me, but it is at least in a dark hardwood. It has rounded corners and fielded panelling. There are a couple of corners with possibly Victorian fireplaces. There's an interesting sort of lantern feature. It's the top of a column that has stained glass in it with the Rose and Crown symbol. The What Pub website also calls out the 12 plates over the fireplace. How do they describe it? The industrious and idle prentice with biblical references. And it also has a nice large garden out the back, which, as you can imagine, on what is, I believe, the hottest day of the year so far, the most popular space of the pub today. So let's take a look at the history of the pub, starting with the name. The Rose and Crown is, of course, a very popular pub name, and it has some relation probably to the War of the Roses. It's interesting that the Dictionary of Pub Names says that it only really started to become common in the early 17th century. Presumably that means immediately after the reign of Queen Elizabeth, who was of course the last Tudor monarch at the time of John Rock's map of 1746. Once again, it's not marked specifically, but there are clearly buildings in this location which could possibly correspond to the Rose and Crown. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for it is 1761, not long after John Rock's map. There is a mention in 1809 in Corbett's Political Register in connection with somebody seemingly trying to bribe their way into a government job. Possibly the pub's most famous association is with Algernon Charles Swinburne, the, I think, somewhat controversial Victorian poet. I think even today some of his work is a little bit eyebrow-raising. If you take, for example, The Leper, which was published in 1866, that covers the maybe unusual bedfellows of leprosy and necrophilia. It was described by at least one critic at the time as infamous, corrupt and detestable. His regular visits in the morning to the Rose and Crown were mentioned in his obituary in this newspaper article of 1909. There's also a photo connected to that obituary showing him striding purposefully across Wimbledon Common on the way to the pub. Quick look at the maps a little bit later on. At the time of the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, you can see what I think is probably an archway leading through to the yard behind it, which is a classic sign of a former coaching inn. And by the mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map, it looks to me like some of that stabling yard has been redeveloped for other uses. To get to the next pub, I'm taking a stroll across Wimbledon Common, leaving Wimbledon Village now. I have, of course, taken precautions, and I have sprayed myself with anti-Womble spray. Pub number 3, the Fox and Grapes. Cheers from the Fox and Grapes. Some bit of foliage here is trying to upstage me, but I will press on. Let's take a look at the exterior first. The main wing, or as it is today, is almost bungalow-like with a relatively low roof and dormer windows in it. I wonder if this possibly may be a newer section of the pub, and the original part may be the one that's off to the left as you're facing it. I believe this pub also functions as another hotel, a boutique hotel, and possibly that two-storey section may now be used for accommodation. The brass plates on the doors may be one of the last vestiges of the original pub fixtures and fittings. Unfortunately did have a bit of a major refurb about a decade ago, according to CAMRA's What Pub website. So this was originally on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors, but was removed in 2014 after a very extensive refurb, which stripped out a lot of those original fittings. They dated, I believe, more to the 20th century than anything older than that. Maybe here and there I can see a couple of remnants despite that very drastic refurb. There's some wood panelling along one side, not sure of the exact date of that, but there is a fireplace adjoining that wood panelling that has some glazed ceramic tiling, and if I had to guess, that looked vaguely mid-century, possibly even 1930s to me. Some bits here and there of stained glass, and they're of course, as always, better appreciated on the inside rather than the outside. Over towards what was originally the public bar side, now just more dining/seating area. There's some bench seating lining the walls, and I suppose some slightly more cosy, homely nooks and crannies over there. The main bar room that was originally the saloon has a vaulted ceiling with some beams running across it. So yes, mostly a very bland, to be honest, very modernised interior. This is a fairly common pub name again. The dictionary of pub names suggests that it derives from Aesop's fable about the fox who was straining to eat some grapes on a high up branch of a vine and then decided to declare them as being sour and unpalatable and that he didn't want them after all. The Fox and Grapes in an earlier incarnation was a beer house. Here is a clear record from 1857 attesting to its status as a beer house at that time. The keeper of the Fox and Grapes was in court, charged with using abusive language at a rival beer shop keeper. It experienced some dust-related issues in 1880. The owner applied for a spirit license in 1883. That was the process by which it would have been upgraded to a full public house rather than just a beer house. If not then, relatively soon after, it was granted a full license, because by the time of the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, it is marked with a PH. And we know from past videos that places which solely operated as beer houses weren't usually marked on the map at this time. On the mid-1900s map, it's also named, and it looks to me as though it has been extended in the interim, and that gives rise to this theory I have that possibly that section off to the left is the original pub. And it does indeed seem to have been given a full licence by the time of the 1892 Surrey licensing records. Today, this is actually the one and only pub on this pub tour that I believe is not operated by Young's. The operator is the Jolly Fine Pub Group, not one I've heard of before. Wednesdays for them is sort of something of a turnover of stock and a tidying up day, so the very nice staff behind the bar did apologise if things were in a little bit of a state of disarray, and I think that possibly extended to the fact that only one of the hand pumps was on. They have 3 hand pumps, but only the, again, that Wimbledon Brewery SW19 that I turned my nose up at the previous pub was the only hand pump on, bit grapefruity. So instead I've gone for a half of Guinness. Single with flake, please.
Yeah.
Is this a regular spot for you, or do you travel about a bit?
No, that's regular spot.
Not usually a huge fan of soft serve, is this called, but you know, when in Rome. Pub number 4, the Hand in Hand. Cheers from the Hand in Hand. My visit here seems to have coincided with the marketing / social media team from Young's, who I've just been chatting to in the back of the pub. Slightly concerned now about some of my former less than favourable comments about Young's beer. Oh well. I think this is a cracking pub, very possibly the best of the lot on today's itinerary. It is a former beer house, and many of those were originally private residences that started just selling beer on the side, and I think you get a definite sense of that here. Looking at the exterior of the building, it does give a bit of a sense of a cottage. This building's not listed. There are other listed buildings here on Crooked Billet, this little street, and at least some of those are cited by Historic England as being sort of mid-18th century. I don't know if this dates back quite as far as that, but possibly it's of a similar age. I was talking to the landlord just now, and he says that the small seating area that I'm in here, immediately in front of the pub, was originally an overgrown garden. It's now a sort of nice beer garden patio. There are tables extending onto the pavement beyond that, and also across the road onto the green. There has been a relatively recent refurb once again. I think it was possibly late 2010s. I will forgive it many of those things because they have Harvey's on the bar, which I am delighted about. This is once again a Young's pub, but the landlord, Andrew, I believe is his name, has free rein and is something of an expert at ale keeping. I believe he provides courses to other publicans on how to keep their beer. Probably while I've been babbling there, I've maybe showed you some of the interior. Like I said, a little bit light and airy, a little bit too bright. There is a bit of possibly Farrow Ball adjacent paint in there, but some corners once again which feel a little bit more pubby, and some nice old memorabilia of the local area on the walls, including some testament to the fact that there was a farrier's, I think, was that possibly next door? Andrew, the landlord, was telling me at one time, so that accounts for these saddles and so forth on the wall in this corner of the pub. The Dictionary of Pub Names says that the Hand in Hand as a pub name may simply indicate a friendly greeting, and therefore it's a suggestion that it's a pub that will offer a warm welcome, and it may not be any more complicated than that. This is another pub which was originally a beer house, so once again I would guess it only dates back to maybe the mid-19th century, as most of those did. Not absolutely all of them, but most of them did. You can see that beer house status reflected in the census records. So, for example, here in 1871, where the head of household at this address, William G. Holland, has his occupation listed as beer retailer. In fact, the Holland family ran the business for over a century, until the 1970s. The pub is also named on the 1881 census, where once again a member of the Holland family is head of household, and also the actual licensing records for 1892 for Surrey confirm it was still a beer house at that time. Once again, I think the main draw here is going to be the beer, especially if, like me, after a couple of pubs you're starting to get a little bit bored of all the Young's beer. Like I said, it is still technically a Young's pub, but the landlord, Andrew, has free rein with the guest beers, so there is just one Young's beer represented on the 4 hand pumps here on today's visit, but also there is a beer from Sambrook's, one from Courage, good old Directors, and of course the one that I went for, Harvey's Sussex Best. Pub number 5, the Crooked Billet, barely 4 doors down from the Hand in Hand. Cheers from the Crooked Billet. Quite an unconventional beer garden setup here. This is, I suppose, a piece of common land, the Crooked Billet Green, immediately in front of the pub. The pub doesn't officially have any outside space of its own, so if you want to come and sit outdoors, you need to get, I suppose this is almost like takeaway, and bring out a deck chair. Let's take a look at the exterior first. Rendered on the upper floor, a sort of slightly pebble dash kind of effect there, and then whitewashed brick to the ground floor. The window frames and other bits of woodwork are painted in a kind of dark blue colour with fairly shallow bay windows along the frontage. There's possibly a total of 3 entrances now. Inside there is once again flagstone flooring. There's possibly some matchboard panelling in places. There's a nice brick fitting in the middle of the main bar area now, which it includes a fireplace and a coal hole. Much of the rest of it looks more modern to me. I'm not sure there's a huge amount of original fixtures and fittings in here. Once again, as it's Wimbledon week, there is a certain amount of Wimbledon paraphernalia, Wimbledon decor in the windows and so forth. It's notable that compared to the Hand in Hand, which was doing a reasonably brisk trade for a weekday afternoon, it seemed that the Crooked Billet was pretty much empty on my visit just now. I don't know if that attests to the fact that this is stylistically a little bit less pubby, perhaps. The Crooked Billet as a pub name is quite a common one. The dictionary of pub names suggests that it really is as simple as just meaning a bent stick, and that may have been one of the original, more primitive pub signs, simply hanging a crooked stick over a door. The street that it's on, and I think I've even heard this referred to as a hamlet on the edge of Wimbledon, is also called Crooked Billet. It's not clear to me whether the street came first or some incarnation of the pub came first. Could be either. On the outside of the pub, it says that it was established in 1750. The earliest newspaper mention I could find was from 1772, which I think is referring to the pub rather than this street or hamlet or whatever this little area of Wimbledon is called. There is a photo, I believe this comes from the Wimbledon Museum of circa 1885, which at one time had been attributed to the Hand in Hand, but some historians believe is actually a photo here of the Crooked Billet. The thing that I particularly like about this is the series of upturned tankards along the fence there. It is yet another Young's pub, so once again I've gone for some London original here, and after that wonderful pint of Harvey's Sussex Best just down the road, feels like a little bit of a step down. So you know, if you are in this neck of the woods and you're only going to pick one pub, I would probably personally suggest just go to the Hand in Hand. But if you don't particularly mind Young's beer, then I suppose there is something quite nice about sitting on the green here in a deck chair on a sunny day like today, watching the world go by. Okay, that is it for today from Wimbledon. Quick hi to Elvis 1977-97, who has been politely badgering me for some time to come down to Wimbledon. I hope I've done that justice. If you're familiar with the area, I'm sure there is something or other that I've missed out which may have been worthy of a visit, but I mostly stuck to that Oliver Reed tour. I think actually that went slightly better than I was anticipating. I had looked at the photos of all those pub interiors on Google Maps before coming here and got the impression that this would just be a wasteland of gastro-pubby type pubs, but at the very least the Hand in Hand I thought retained a really solid, decent pubby feel. The beer was really good. Andrew, the landlord there, clearly somebody who loves pubs and loves beer, and you know what, I actually think the Rose and Crown had at least some interest. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.